But I want to ask you, what about the rest of the Bible? Because here's a problem that many people have. But if I had a witness in court, and that witness told one lie, that witness's testimony throughout those proceedings would be diminished irreparably by the one lie. So what am I supposed to make of Old Testament texts about murder, about dealing with concubines, about this bizarre book of the Revelation where there's horses and scrolls and images? What about all of that? What about those parts of the Bible?
Tim Keller, best-selling author and a pastor, answers difficult questions from NBC journalist Martin Bashir at Columbia University. How can we reconcile difficult chapters in the Old Testament, such as those involving murder and concubines, with our belief in a loving God? And doesn't the odd imagery in the book of Revelation call into question the Bible's overall credibility? Tim Keller discusses how to approach these tough texts and how Jesus' life and teachings might help us grasp the Bible's credibility.
You mention the Bible, and in the book itself, you take a great deal of time to argue for its trustworthiness. And you build your evidence around the evidence of the New Testament and principally the life of Christ. And you point the reader at witnesses, at the fact that these documents were written very soon after Christ, that they were not mythical legends. And you spend a great deal in the book in that whole area. But I want to ask you, what about the rest of the Bible? Because here's a problem that many people have. You argue in the book, well, look at the witnesses. Well, look at how recently the New Testament letters and Gospels were written. But if I had a witness in court, and that witness told one lie, that witness's testimony throughout those proceedings would be diminished irreparably by the one lie. So what am I supposed to make of Old Testament texts about murder, about dealing with concubines, about this bizarre book of the Revelation where there's horses and scrolls and images? What about all of that? What about those parts of the Bible?
The Gospels are the most accessible thing, and they're the most crucial thing to look at. The reason I talk about the Gospels is because you've really got a lot of evidence that the Gospels reliably convey to us Jesus' life and words. And if you decide, this actually is a very similar line of reasoning from me that I just gave you. If you decide that Jesus is who he said he is, then Jesus himself looks at the rest of the Bible with the greatest respect. Almost every book of the Bible, of the Older Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, is actually quoted by Jesus authoritatively. So you can, if you say, I'm going to read the entire Bible and find anything that's incredible to me, and I'm going to decide whether I accept it or not that way, again, if Jesus is who he said he is, then you have to actually deal with the whole Bible because Jesus himself took it as authoritatively. If Jesus is not who he said he is, who cares about the rest of the Bible? Because that means the core of it isn't true.
But in your book, you make great effort to argue around the life of Christ.
Yeah.
And you deal with the issue of the authenticity and trustworthiness of the Bible, which is a huge question for all of us. And what I'm asking you is, do you not find that what you say about those passages in the Bible may well be robust, but elsewhere the case is undermined rather badly?
Well, maybe I didn't say this just right.
Maybe I'm thick. Explain it in more simple terms.
Well, maybe you're just being a great interrogator. It's difficult. In fact, actually, nobody really knows how to get at the patriarchs, whether Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did the things they did. What you have with Jesus and the Gospels is it's much more recent. You've got all kinds of evidence of it being eyewitness, having eyewitness accounts. And so the way for me to trust what the Bible says about the patriarchs is, is Jesus who he says he is? If I decide he is, then I take what he says about the patriarchs seriously. And I can't, from my vantage point, do a very good job of saying, there's miraculous elements in the Old Testament, therefore it's no good.
Or murder.
Well, actually, murder is done in the Old Testament, but it's not condoned in the Old Testament. Just because something is in a narrative, it's a little easier to read the epistles, where Paul says, I'm writing to you as a pastor, and you're the church, and I want you to do this, this, and this. Very simple. But for example, in Genesis, let me give you this example. In Genesis, you have all kinds of horrible things happening. You've got, for example, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they all have more than one wife, polygamy. So many people read the book of Genesis and they say, this is ridiculous. Look at all these contradictions. Here in the Old Testament, it condones polygamy. Robert Alter, who's a great biblical scholar, a Hebrew narrative scholar at Berkeley, I believe. Robert Alter says, anybody who reads the book of Genesis sees all the heroes having multiple wives and thinks, anybody who reads that and thinks that that's condoning polygamy has not learned how to read narrative. Every single person with multiple wives is having an absolutely miserable time. Just read it. And he says,
I've got one wife.
Yeah.
I know what you're talking about.
He also says, if you also read it, you have Abel is the good guy rather than Cain, Isaac rather than Ishmael, Jacob ends up being chosen over Esau, and what you actually have is the law of primogeniture, which is the oldest son gets everything, and the law of polygamy, which is men can take all the wives they want. They're undermined by the book of Genesis. And so generally what people do is they read very, very superficially the Old Testament. They see all these horrible things happening. They say, this is a crock. And the answer is they haven't really learned how to read it.
Okay.
The Bible is a unique collection of texts that serve as a guide for living a life that honors God. These texts were written over centuries in various historical, cultural, and literary contexts. Understanding this is essential when interpreting difficult passages. The Old Testament, for example, includes historical narratives, laws, poetry, and prophecies. Each genre has its own rules for interpretation. When we read about events such as wars, murder, or the presence of concubines, it's important to recognize that these accounts describe what happened, not necessarily what should happen. God often condemns the immoral behaviors recorded in these stories. Consider the command God gave to the Israelites to destroy the Canaanites. At first glance, this seems harsh and contradictory to God's nature. However, understanding the historical and moral context is crucial. The Canaanites were known for their extreme immorality, including child sacrifice and other detestable practices. God's command was an act of judgment against profound evil, similar to how he later judged Israel for their sins. The Bible's narratives often show the consequences of sin. For instance, while polygamy is mentioned in Genesis, it is not endorsed. The stories of figures like Abraham, Jacob, and David highlight the turmoil and complications that arise from such practices. These narratives teach us about the flaws in human actions and the need for God's guidance. The Book of Revelation. The Book of Revelation, with its vivid imagery of horses, scrolls, and symbolic language, falls into the category of apocalyptic literature. This genre uses symbolic imagery to convey deeper spiritual truths and future events. Understanding Revelation requires recognizing its symbolism and the context in which it was written, a time of persecution for early Christians. When it comes to the authenticity of the Bible, it's important to rely on more than personal or cultural beliefs. Here are key reasons for trusting the Bible. Historical reliability. The Bible is a collection of historical documents. The New Testament, in particular, contains writings by eyewitnesses or those who interviewed eyewitnesses. These documents were written within the lifetime of other eyewitnesses, allowing for verification and scrutiny. Eyewitness testimony. The Gospels provide detailed accounts of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. These were written by or based on the testimony of those who directly witnessed these events. This close proximity to the events they describe lends credibility to their accounts. Supernatural events. The Bible records supernatural events that fulfill specific prophecies. For instance, the prophecies about the Messiah in the Old Testament are fulfilled in the life of Jesus. These fulfillments are not random but are detailed and specific, pointing to a divine orchestration, divine origin. The Bible claims to be inspired by God. This is not a baseless claim, but is supported by its consistency, historical reliability, and the transformative impact it has had on countless lives throughout history. The internal coherence of the Bible, despite being written over centuries by different authors, further supports its divine origin. In summary, understanding the Bible requires recognizing its historical, cultural, and literary contexts. Challenging passages, such as those about murder or concubines in the Old Testament, need to be interpreted within their broader narrative and moral framework. The Book of Revelation's symbolic language also requires careful interpretation. Belief in the Bible should be grounded in its historical reliability, the credibility of eyewitness testimonies, the fulfillment of prophecies, and its divine inspiration. By approaching the Bible with these considerations, we can appreciate its depth and trustworthiness. The Bible, far from being undermined by difficult passages, is a coherent and reliable guide to understanding God's will and purpose for humanity.